On today's episode, we hear how only Republicans are authoritarian hacks, find that $800 million is still not a large enough payout for some who want to punish speech, hear how Republicans want to throw you in jail for smoking weed and Democrats don't, see the reasons someone wants to vote Democrat, learn that Vladimir Putin is the biggest environmentalist, and how Joe Walsh is a woke conservative. This is Cringe Posts. Hello, friends. Welcome to the 100th episode of the Cringe Posts podcast. My name is Donald, and I'm here with my co-host, Britt. This is, of course, the show where we gather the cringiest political and cultural takes that we find in our social media feeds. We talk about them. We break down where they go wrong, what assumptions they are making incorrectly, and, of course, we try to have a laugh along the way. Before we get into other people's bad posts, we always like to take on some of our own bad posts or memories and things like that, because we've all said or posted cringe. It's true, we are all human, and to be human is to be cringe at times. So before we get into that, just a reminder to like and share and comment. All that good stuff really helps us out, helps us keep growing, which we appreciate. So without further ado, we're gonna go to Britt here, who's who's going to recount a story with the title here, Abraham Lincoln is the greatest president.
Yeah, so not as much a story as more of like a summary of a period of my life. So, for the longest time, I used to have this placemat at my dinner table. It had all of the presidents all the way up to George W. Bush, because that was, at the time, that was the furthest that we had gotten. And I used to memorize the order of the presidents and everything, and I read biographies on all of them, and like books that we had on our own shelves and stuff like that. And my mother, amazing woman, really fantastic leader, both business wise and, as a mother to us and everything like that. But she really enjoyed Lincoln as like the principles that Lincoln had. And so she had these books called Lincoln on Leadership and different things like that. And so, naturally, I read those books as a kid, and I'd see them, and so whenever someone asked me like, "Oh, who do you think the greatest president is, or who is your favorite president?" I would naturally say Abraham Lincoln, because I was like, "Oh, well, he's great. He kept the country together, and all these different sorts of things. He ended slavery." Obviously, now I think within probably the past 4 years, if you ask me who I think the worst president is, it might be Abraham Lincoln. Probably would be Woodrow Wilson, but definitely Abraham Lincoln, close second. And for all sorts of manners of reasons, whether it's suspending habeas corpus or the fact that he was actually a racist in a lot of ways that only really cared about keeping the maximum amount of power for himself, whether it was freeing the slaves or not freeing the slaves. Just happened to be that he would get the most power by freeing the slaves. I mean, maybe he had some good leadership principles. How much of those were actually like things he exhibited or not, or those were just projected onto him by an author that wanted to, kind of ride the coattails of Lincoln enthusiasm, I'm not sure. But by no means do I think he is the greatest president. In fact, he's kind of gone to the opposite end for me in a lot of ways.
Yeah, Lincoln is a funny case because he espouses a lot of noble and virtuous ideas in writings that he has. But when it comes down to putting them into practice, it doesn't seem like they carry through. I think when you're saying, what's his quote is something about like, if I could keep the Union together without freeing the slaves, I would. Yep. There's some quote to that effect. And, I will say that him putting into law an action that kind of freed a lot of slaves in the South, not in the North, mind you, but in the South, even though his intent wasn't for the right reasons and it wasn't a perfect thing, it's a good thing that happened. I don't want to take that away, and I think that's one of the problems that a lot of people get into when you criticize Lincoln, is you don't almost make that caveat where it's like, well, look, a good thing can come about from a bad president, but recognize that he was a bad president. It's like, don't make the mistake that I'm saying the outcome of slavery ending is a bad thing. So it's a good thing, but also recognize that he was not achieving that end intentionally. He was not achieving that end by purpose, it's like, if you're going to admire someone for leadership on the slave trade, like, look for actual noble heroes like William Wilberforce, and don't crown this guy who's like, yeah, I would have rather done this another way if I could. where I just want to consolidate power. I'm just going to arrest people who speak out against my decisions and actions. I'm going to suspend the Constitution in multiple places and really set the big one of the biggest pushes into turning America into this behemoth empire that we are, instead of these unified but individual states that we once were.
Well, I think it's also that quote that you're talking about where he says, hey, if I could preserve the Union, whether I freed the slaves or did not free the slaves, I would do whatever it is to preserve the Union. I mean, it makes it all the more obvious that this person craved power, right? Like, it was like, oh, I want the power to be able to do this. And all of the deaths, all the reason for the deaths, I mean, it sheds a whole new light on all the actions that he took. Like we were talking about suspending habeas corpus, or the fact that when he did the Emancipation Proclamation, it only applied to the slaves in the South. It did not apply to slaves that resided in northern states. And sure, people talk about the line and all these different things, but regardless, it's the same principle, right? Like this guy was willing to play games with human lives to hold on to his power, and threw people in jail for it. Kind of a late day, back in the day, Zelensky, I guess you could say. There's a lot of comparisons there in terms of willing to do awful things while also kind of virtue signaling that he is an awesome person. So yeah, that's why past me venerated Lincoln, as most people do. And I venerated him because most people around me venerated him as well.
Yeah, well, and there's a very simplistic culture when it comes to teaching on the Civil War, and it makes me think of the Simpsons clip from years ago when Apu is taking his U.S. citizenship test, and they cut into this scene and they ask him, "All right, last question. What caused the Civil War? What was the Civil War about?" And he goes, "Well, it was a number of factors. There was social economic strife, and there was a clash of really complicated." And the guy stops. Just say slavery. Just say slavery. And they're just highlighting the hilarity that is how reductionist we are in the U.S. about it. When you actually look at it, it was a number of issues and things. Okay, we'll move on to our first external cringe post here, and this oh gosh, this is a conversation between two blue check marks. Joe Walsh starts by tweeting, "On CNN, I say often that this Republican Party is a threat to our democracy. So no, I don't want Republicans to win back the House or Senate. John Kasich on CNN just said, of course I want Republicans to win the Senate. How can Kasich say that? Does he not see the same threat?" So that could have been a cringe post. But then I saw this quote retweet of that responding from Andy Ostroy. Maybe I'm mispronouncing that, who is a blue check mark, who says, "It's simple, Joe, because John Kasich is full of crap. You can't be mainstream and want to give power control to a party that promotes lawlessness, election theft, and autocracy, ... And both of these posts actually are very close to accidentally based territory. And what I mean by that is, if you look at Joe Walsh's original tweet, he says, how can Kasich say that? Does he not see the same threat? Or of course I want him, Joe Walsh criticizing John Kasich for just blindly supporting Republicans. Accidentally kind of based. However, the problem is all of the reasons for his fear of supporting Republicans is wrong. So the idea that, if you're going to be a Republican or you're going to vote for Republican candidates, that you should only want that party to win. Yeah, that is a little reductionist. That is a little silly to think that just because the letter next to your name is one way and you're going to vote along party lines here, that you're going to get a better outcome. That is a silly way to think. Unfortunately, Joe Walsh's metrics for how he measures what is important or what is virtuous is totally off. So him thinking that this Republican Party is a threat to our democracy, as if that's even, the tantamount important thing here. Looking at January 6th and thinking that was a threat to democracy is like looking at a fly buzzing around your room and thinking that it's a threat to your house's foundation. It's such an overblown, crazy level of proportions that you're freaking out, just trying to drive frenzy because you've I don't know, you're worried that people are actually onto how the elites manipulating things and driving inflation up and ruining lives of people in ordinary levels. So they're like, crap, we have to distract them. Throw January 6th at them again. What a silly thing to act as though you're shocked that John Kasich is gonna want the Republicans to win. The funny thing is, like, do you even consider yourself a Republican anymore? I don't know if Joe Walsh does. I think
we'll find out later.
Yeah, exactly. We've got to take later that answers this question. But you're like, if you consider yourself a Republican at any point, then it's, I don't know, it's like, it shouldn't be that surprising that another Republican wants Republicans to win. At that point, you should categorically distinguish yourself. Otherwise, you're just a virtue signaling tool, really.
Yeah, the obvious side of this that popped out to me was Andy's last sentence was like, how can you be mainstream and vote for a party that promotes lawlessness and violence and all these sorts of things? It's like, okay, like you're saying, almost accidentally based, right? Like if you take the two parties that we've got, and I mean, they're not even two. They're the uniparty, which when they're united, support wars and spending blood and treasure in foreign countries, promoting an income tax and stealing wealth from the citizens of the United States, printing trillions of dollars, doing modern monetary theory and all these sorts of things that are crazy and have broken our system, are way out there. They're considered the mainstream. It's more like they're the extremists. Everyone else that just wants, like, we want to be peaceful, live at home. We want to be able to work our lives, keep the money that we earn, actually own the property that we have purchased. They're considered the extremists. It's like, no, so mainstream and extremists are kind of flipped. He's kind of almost accidentally based, because if he was describing both Republicans and Democrats, he would be right.
Exactly.
You can't say you're mainstream and then support either of these parties, because neither of these parties actually represent the interest of the average American person. And any political party does not represent the average interest of the people that they purport to represent. I can't remember the specific statistic, but if we scaled the amount of representatives that we had, the ratio of representatives that we had back, when the country was first formed, to today, with how the population has scaled in the United States, it'd be something like we have 37 or 38,000 representatives. We still only have 100 senators, in Congress. So it has not scaled represented. There's a lot more people being represented by fewer and fewer people out there. It's also rich, coming from this side, because they're just blaming the Republicans, and this is where it becomes unbased. Is that it's like, okay, for the past 2 years we've had the example of the Democrats literally promoting and bailing out people that lived lawlessly, burned down billions and billions of dollars of property, were able to commit crimes, raid Macy's in New York City on camera, all these sorts of things. People talk about defunding the police. I don't necessarily like the police, and I think I agree with that statement in a way that is not the same as the people usually saying defund the police. But the party that is literally calling for less law, less order, less good deeds, less moral activity, you can't claim that voting for them, or voting against them is voting for a Republican Party that is lawless. It's like, yeah, there was January 6th, like you were mentioning, not super great. But when you look at comparison, to what's happened the past 2 years, it's like, okay, some government property was damaged and a Trump supporter was shot and killed. Not even any Joe Biden or Democrat. It was a Trump supporter that was killed on that. That was the only casualty, and very, very sad, obviously. But it was government property that was destroyed, paid for in part, at least, by the people that decided to go raid and riot at the Capitol. So, when we've gone through Joe Walsh's, not Joe Walsh, Joe Scarborough, right? That was the guy, taco stand, Joe.
Oh yeah, it was Joe Scarborough. Yeah,
Scarborough. Yeah.
Basically
saying like, oh, like why should I care about a taco stand more than the government building? It's like, well, the government building is going to get paid for, and the taco stand is not, and that's someone's livelihood. So, these guys like to. It should just illustrate to you, the Republicans do the same exact thing to the Democrats. They say, hey, you're going to be voting for this party that wants to restrict freedom or do this or do that. And then once they get into office, they're right back there, passing the Patriot Act and doing all sorts of awful things that restrict freedom. So both parties suck. And this guy would be right if he was talking about both of them, but he's not. He's trying to just amass power for his own team.
Yeah, and it's funny because he says you can't be mainstream and want to give power control to a party that promotes lawlessness, election theft, autocracy. No. I think you have to be mainstream to support that. Like that's the mainstream parties right now. At the very least, both want autocracy, and frankly, they both kind of do want lawlessness at the very top levels of it, right? At least the people in power do. They want to be exempted from laws themselves. Now that again, that comes across very differently, right? Um, but I mean, you look at the Democrats as far as lawlessness in the additions of what you were giving, but then also look at in the ways that it's rules for thee and not for me. You know, Gavin Newsom eating during the COVID restrictions and having that party with all those people, no masks, people in public ballparks, and then slipping the masks on. All of their leaders at the top also want lawlessness, and that's true of Republicans and Democrats, I think. But the other thing that makes me laugh is when he says election theft. I don't know what he means by that, because both parties have done it both ways. I genuinely don't know if he's saying they're promoting election theft as in they're promoting stealing elections, or if they're promoting the idea that the election was stolen. And that's the problem, because both parties have done both, right? Like Stacey Abrams had never conceded because she said that the election was stolen from her. So if they're talking about, a party that promotes election theft theories, well, the Democrats and the Republicans have claimed that. And if you're claiming that, the Republicans are promoting actual election theft, well, then aren't you just as good as them, which is claiming that there are stolen elections? It's just a funny one that he slips in there. And to me, it seems like it's just another buzzword you can throw in without having to think through the implications of the position that you're claiming there.
Totally agree.
Okay, our next post comes from someone who reads, "Holy crap, this still doesn't feel enough." To the headline, Alex Jones ordered to pay Sandy Hook victims' families over $800 million. And then the little summary of the case. A jury in Connecticut awarded damages to the families of 8 victims killed in the 2012 shooting and an FBI agent who responded to the scene. Jones had already been found liable for defamation after he spent years falsely describing the shooting. Now, I saw this and it made me twinge a little bit, but I wasn't quite sure. And so I was doing a little bit of listening and research, and what's going on here is actually terrifying, because the trial done in Connecticut, there were 2 trials. One was in Connecticut, and I don't remember where the other one was.
But it happened in
Austin, that's right. And they were both done, but in particular, the one in Connecticut were done in such a way where Alex Jones could not answer things. He was scripted in certain ways. He could not explain. He could not give more than yes or no. He was legally required to give yes or no answers to questions that required more explanation and nuance, because this was all being filmed for a documentary. And he had provided the most evidence almost ever in terms of how much money he had made based on receipts and donations during the times he spoke about this. He was not allowed to present any of that evidence and witness. And then there's also just the craziness of the fact that there were no provable claims about damages done to reputation or livelihood from these families in direct connection. So you have to make you have to provide evidence that your reputation was harmed as part of these charges, and they never actually had to demonstrate. It was all assumed in the trial. And the standard that they used for it was something about they claimed that they were victims of being specifically called out and defamed. But there is a precedent where if you are claiming that you were targeted by defamation, you have to prove that you were specifically being referred to. And the smallest group that usually has gone into is groups 25. So the example that I heard given was, for instance, if someone said, "Oh, KFC sells poison," an individual KFC store could not sue and claim that they were being defamed, because he was just talking generally broadly about a large group. There was not an individual. However, if someone said that KFC on 72nd Street sells poison, then they have the right, because they can prove that they were specifically targeted. And the problem is Alex Jones never specified any individual people with these families when he was talking about this. For one, he talked about it very little, but the way it was defined was basically now that anyone with any relative connection to the case can claim these damages. And that's why you have the FBI agent there who almost had literally almost nothing to do with it and has no provable, demonstrable harm to the credibility of the FBI or the credibility of these families. None of that was proved, none of it. And so if you have any relative connection with this case, you could cash in, which is a terrible precedent to set.
Yeah, what was crazy to me, obviously, I think normal people when looking this and the way that I looked, I was like, okay, like if he lied about it, which he did, whether it was knowingly or not, he said things that were not true about the shooting. And yeah, those could be damaging in some ways. How much, how damaging? Like that was the big question to me. And when I saw $800 million, I think the actual final number is more like $970 million, something like that. So with that combined with the judgment from the Austin court case, he's over $1 billion now, and there's another case coming up, right? So there's been 2 of 3 done. So this guy has been sued for, and the damages have been taken from him up to $1 billion, just over $1 billion worth. And so you think, okay, that's a lot of money, right? And like surely, right? Like I know that there were lawsuits against the estate of the actual guy who killed these kids. There were lawsuits against the weapon manufacturer of the weapon that was actually used within this act, which is obviously a very awful act that actually happened. And so you have to ask yourself, okay, so who got charged more? The people that killed the guy that killed these kids, the weapon manufacturer that provided the weapon. You and I both agree that shouldn't be held liable. But like from these people's logic, like you certainly have a better case to make that they're more tied to damages to these families, right, than Alex Jones going on InfoWars and talking about this. So Remington was sued for $73 million. 73. That's what their damages were taken from them, was $73 million. The estate of the shooter, we won't mention his name, but his estate was sued and awarded only $1.5 million. And then you think about people like O.J. Simpson, who was charged after the whole thing was over, in a civil case for killing his wife and her lover. He only was supposed to pay $33 million. So when you get that, murder is worth less in terms of damages than Alex Jones speaking and saying something that was false, and that he later admitted, right? He admitted on the same platform. He admitted more times than he claimed falsely that it happened. He apologized for it, all sorts of stuff. So it becomes obvious, right, that this is just a complete and utter witch hunt for Alex Jones. And I mean, the attorneys themselves specified this in the court cases. They literally said, yes, Alex Jones owes you money, but we're seeking more than what he would owe in a normal defamation case because we want to be punitive and we want you to take away. Jury, please rule in such a way that takes away his platform so we can never be on the air ever again. And so this person posting this saying, holy crap, still doesn't feel like it's enough, knows nothing about any of this stuff. They're only guided by the ideology that they've been told to abide by, that Alex Jones is somehow worse than the person that actually killed these kids, somehow worse than, even if Remington literally talked to this guy and this guy said, hey, I want to get one of your guns to go, kill these people. It's like they still don't think that's worse than Alex Jones. And so don't buy all the media narrative. Don't buy NBC and CNN and all these folks saying like, oh, thank God, like this is a victory, a moral victory. It's like, no, this is actually terrifying, because what it does is it says, if we don't like your speech, the federal government can come in and say, hey, we're going to screw you. Basically, we're going to get you on every little charge. We're going to tie your hands behind your back. This is reminiscent of some of the worst show trials that we've ever seen on any sort of TV show or that we've read about in any history books. I went to Hungary in Budapest, and I got to see, the secret police courts and the secret police stations and all these places where they had these kangaroo trials that forced people to admit that they were wrong under duress. And I think you were referencing the Tom Woods episode that went through all of this earlier. Anyone that is really interested in the nitty gritty of these details and the trial details should go listen to that, because Alex Jones was literally told, hey, you can't actually present discovery. Great job assembling all of these records about how much money you made, and all this stuff. they fast forwarded to summary judgment. They didn't even allow a trial to take place. And some of the reasoning behind it, which is also equally scary, is the fact that the reason summary judgment was granted was because they're like, well, most of these posts took place on social media. Alex Jones' entire social media presence has been deleted. Therefore, he can't provide discovery or evidence against it. So we're going to move to summary judgment. And because the judge is an activist judge, automatically ruled in favor of, the plaintiffs. And so it's really, really scary. If it can happen to him, it can happen to any of us. And we're seeing it, it's happened kind of to the president of the United States or the former presidents of the United States. So everyone should be worried about this. Everyone should be concerned because this is basically codifying and setting precedent for wrong speech.
Yeah. And I mean, it's frustrating because this is one of those cases where people are like, yeah, of course he deserves to he said all these horrible things. And it's like, I don't know, like saying bad things to a point, you should be held responsible, but to the level that he did, this is like people who still believe things about Trump. Like, I don't know, that he was calling white supremacists very fine people, which is obviously a lie and blown out of proportion. And that's the level of delusion that these people live in, where Alex Jones barely talked about this. Did he say bad things? Yeah, sure. But I've said wrong things before. And I don't know.
That's the whole point of our podcast, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly. And it's like, you saying an individual thing, unless you, again, can demonstrably prove that it was a direct correlation to the harms that they're trying to claim, well, then shoot, you really got to be careful about punishing this kind of just speech in general. And also to think that this is such a sham of a justice system where you have this evidence, but because of it was deleted. It's like, I don't know, maybe this is an age thing, or it's more likely just an excuse to not accept verifiable evidence. But like that should not be, when you have access to the truth, but on a technicality you want to ignore it. That is not justice, and that's not a feature that should be in a system that's purported to serve justice, right? So I don't know. I find that this whole thing very despicable and scary for future legal proceedings. I think conservatives have often thought we just need law and order. We just need the law on our sides. The courts will vindicate us. And I think more and more you're seeing that there are these activist ideologues who get into positions of power that the right has historically liked, because historically sort of nerdy right-winger type people get into these positions and they uphold the codified law, which already is problematic when the codified law sucks. But now you're getting even beyond to the point where the codified law doesn't matter, because the way it's going to get interpreted will be done for activist ends. And that's always the problem with accrued power, as I think you and I have been saying for a long time, and what libertarians in general have always been saying. And the problem with, trying to solve today's problems with government power is they become tomorrow's long-term consequences.
Yep.
So I think that this is the kind of principle you need to apply to like antitrust and to big tech and all these things, where it's very, very tempting as someone who has dissident opinions and doesn't want big power conglomerates taking control. I don't like that either, but using government and trying to use the institutions there through the law and through legal proceedings and through these institutions and creating this quote unquote legitimate source of power, you then create the ways that your enemies are going to use it against you. And then you have the big corporations and the big government against you, rather than just maybe one or the other. All right, moving on to our next cringe post. This comes from Pod Save America, and they tweet a clip from their show with the quote of it, which says, "It's a simple message. Republicans want to throw you in jail for smoking weed. Democrats don't. It doesn't get much easier than that. We react to Biden's actions on marijuana on a new pod out now." And this is so funny to me because this one's not even that deep, but this one just cracked me up. Like, are we living in 1980s still? this person, like, he looks fairly young, but he's acting like he was, born in the Reagan era or like living in the Reagan era. honestly, right now, the most movement for pro marijuana stuff that I've seen comes from populists on both sides. And I think you once the establishment has gotten wind of some things, you'll have Chuck Schumer and Joe Biden talking about how they're all for it and doing actions, which is great, but it's not on a party basis. There's so many Democrats that have opposed this over the years. I know a lot of populist Republicans who are not thinking this way. So again, to think in this term is very, very archaic and outdated. I don't think Republicans are great on the drug war. I think more often than not, they do want to throw you in jail for some drugs, but I feel like marijuana is not that drug anymore. And we live in 2022, not 1981.
Well, who is this person saying when they say Democrats or Republicans? Yeah. Because would you say that the president and the vice president of the United States are representative of Democrats? The guy that was on the Democrat nomination for president, the highest office in the country, is he representative of you as well as his number two, Kamala Harris? It's like, I guess you have to grant that they're representative Democrats. And if they are, you have to reconcile that, one, Biden passed and was the biggest advocate for the 1994 crime bill, which basically the reason most of these folks are in jail for smoking or using marijuana is because of the law that he championed. As well as you think about Kamala Harris, if you remember back in the debate, she got wrecked by Tulsi Gabbard for her record as a district attorney in San Francisco, where she oversaw over 1,900 fellows going to jail over cannabis convictions, right? So she laughed about it too. When she was questioned, she was like, "Hey, did you have any issue? You smoked pot and you also sent people to jail while you were smoking pot for smoking pot." And she's like, she did her classic creepy laugh and couldn't answer it. And so, these folks do want to send you to jail. So I don't know what this guy's talking about. I'm just going to take it that, Kamala Harris and Joe Biden represent the Democratic Party because they occupy the highest, office. And the other side of it is like, okay, sure. Let's grant it. Let's just say that Democrats don't want to throw you in jail for doing marijuana. They want to throw you in jail for a lot less and for a lot of other reasons, like for the crime of wanting to keep your money and not, have it taken from you for Social Security or for any of their programs that they want to do. There are a lot of them that thought that you should be thrown in jail if you tried to skirt around the vaccine mandates and you were trying to fly, or if you were working at a business and they forced the business to because the business has 100 employees or more, you've got to get a vaccine. And if they didn't pay the fine, then people were going to go to jail. So both parties, the Uniparty, as we talked about earlier, there's not really a whole lot of difference between them because they want to throw you in jail for the entire gambit of things they can throw you in jail for. Whether it's marijuana or paying your income taxes or, let's say you didn't pay a parking ticket, all of those things are things they want to send you straight to jail for. None of them are good. Republicans suck too, in a lot of ways on this stuff. I really dislike the we need to get tough on drugs and just say no kind of arm of the Republican Party. But like you're saying, that's the 1980s, that's really not representative very much of modern day politics and positions people hold. Go for it.
Oh yeah, I was just gonna say, I think this just seems like obvious, general Biden shilling, which is such a weird thing to do. But I'm not super familiar with this particular group. I've heard the name and familiar, but man, if that's the the quote unquote alternative media that you're listening to, I would recommend getting some actual alternative sources that are more interesting because this is pretty pathetic.
Yeah.
Okay. Next post comes from our good friend Brooklyn Dad Defiant, who tweets, "I don't want people dictating who I'm allowed to love, who I'm allowed to marry, whether I can use contraceptives, how they're going to end my Social Security, what women are allowed to do with their bodies. That's why I'm voting Democrat." Man, dude, if you don't want people dictating how you live your life in all these various respects, I've got really bad news for you. And that is you're just trading one list for the other if you're going to go Democrat versus Republican. If you're trading those two, you can just swap out that list with another list of things that they're going to, prefer to dictate. So if they're telling you, I don't want someone to dictate how what I inject in my body. I don't want someone dictating what I have to spend my money on and what I do or don't have to pay for. And all these, there's a list of a million things that the Democrats are going to regulate just any more than the Republicans. So the other funny thing is like who I'm allowed to love. That's never been an issue. No one has ever dictated that. Just to clarify the position, who I'm allowed to marry. Well, marriage has a definition. And so trying to redefine things is probably where you're having an issue, right? Because you want to change the definition of a religious institution. That sounds like probably a thing that you should take up within the religious institution. And if the religious institution is able to, come to terms with what you agree to marry, then great, do that. But don't force me to carry out something that violates my religion either. So there's just, all his whole list there is just kind of, it's kind of mopey and pathetic a little bit. And he acts as though the Democrats have never instructed people on what they can or can't do with their bodies, what they can or can't do with their money, what they can or can't do legally, which is just a shallow and an absurd thing to think.
I think the thing that's tricky about these and what's somewhat deceiving about it is this, because I've seen this posted in a variety of formats before, and it comes across as having like, oh, this person's very principled, right? Like we love freedom and that means this. And the thing is, it's like they give out this very selective list of things that they want freedom on. And you're like, okay, like I could see why. And like, maybe you agree with some of them too, right? Like I agree, like I shouldn't control who someone else can love, right? Like I can have an opinion about whether that's a good or a bad thing. But yeah, I'm not going to go up to them and point a gun at their head and say, you can't love this person anymore or anything like that. I agree with your thing about marriage. It's like, one, that's a religious institution, should never ever have had the government in it in the first place. And so if you want to go make your own fake, Christian religion off of the Bible that says, people can, same-sex marriage is okay, and that you just omit all the parts of the Bible that basically say you can't do that, then sure, go for it. But you're not also going to force, my church to go participate in those things. So you see these things, you're like, okay, I get it. Like, this is good. And it resonates with my values. And I understand why freedom is important. And we live in America and freedom is great. We're founded on liberty. And then you realize it's like, oh, but this guy doesn't actually, like, the principle doesn't run all the way through the reason for these things, right? Because it's like, think about why is it a virtuous thing to say, hey, people can love who they want to love or make their own decisions? Well, it's a virtuous thing because it's not harming other people. It only harms the people that are in the transaction. And as long as the people that are within that transaction are voluntarily agreeing to participate in it together and with each other, then it's fine. I have no business dealing with it. They have to reap the consequences, and that's all fine. It's like, okay, well, that's the principle that undergirds all of these things. Now, try to apply that to all things, right? Like, you can't just selectively apply it, because if it's a principle that makes one thing good, you have to apply that principle across all opinions on everything. And where it breaks down is he talks about what was it? Let me add it back in. How they're going to end my Social Security. His last point. Okay, so you've established I want to have a good, I have this principle. If it doesn't hurt other people, then they should be allowed to do it. It's none of my business. And then he says, don't remove my Social Security, which I took from you, at gunpoint, at threat of gunpoint, confiscated from your paycheck without any choice. Without any, acceptance from you, you were forced to do it. It's like, okay, so your principle doesn't actually apply to everything that you think about. It seems like you're selectively choosing what you want to apply that principle to. You don't actually care about freedom. You only care about power. You only care about the things that you can force down on other people that benefit you. And that's not really any way to live, right? So now at least don't pose these things under the veil of like, oh, I love freedom and I'm a principled liberty lover. It's like, no, you're not, man. You're just a democratic hack that has a certain set of ideologies that you want to force on other people at the threat of gunpoint. And that you don't want to admit that, because that kind of makes you look like a monster, which you are. But here we are to tell you, you are a monster. So don't say those things and don't pretend to be something that you're not.
Every restriction that an individual supports, like this guy, right? Every restriction, which let's be honest, Social Security is a restriction. It's a restriction of how you can spend your money. It's a restriction of being able to take your own income, whatever it is. All these restrictions that these people support, well, that one's justified, right? You don't understand. That one makes sense. That one's right. But everything else that these other people want to impose, that's the problem. And of course, for every single human on this planet, that list is going to be different, which is why maybe we should be the only things we should be forcing or promoting are things that are contrary to the use of force, right? So you have to, if you're going to force, quote unquote, something, well, force people to not hurt other people unprovoked, force them to not destroy or steal other people's property unprovoked, and not force them to force other people to do things, right? Those are the principles that you and I would hold to. As far as what people should be required to not do. Essentially, we're not requiring people to do things; we're requiring them to not do them. And it's a little bit of a backwards thing to say you're forcing someone to not force other people to do things. But those are the principles of liberty. Those are the things where then you can have a society of people who are able to live freely and truly let people live and let live. Now, people aren't always going to get along, and I recognize that, but they're certainly not going to get along when you require them and you chip away at their freedoms, you chip away at what is rightfully theirs by their property, by their work, by their families, whatever individual institution it is. If you specifically force people to behave or act in a certain way, they're only going to take so much before there's inevitable conflict. And that's what I think posts like this totally ignore. They think, if I have the blueprint of what I think is right and these particular values people should hold, and then we force people into those, then that's the perfect society that will happen. And I just don't think that that's realistic. I don't live in a utopia like that.
Totally agree.
All right, moving to our next post. This one comes from Politico Europe, which tweeted, "It took a war criminal to speed up Europe's green revolution. Vladimir Putin's brutal invasion of Ukraine has forced Europe to finally break its fossil fuel addiction. For this reason, he has topped our inaugural Politico Green 28 list." My friend put it brilliantly. He said, "Imagine dedicating your life to trying to solve the green energy crisis and then losing to a freaking war criminal." Holy crap. If you did not believe before this that the broader green movement was an ideological religion that is willing to trade values of human flourishing, human life, and human liberty for this ideological end, I don't know what else to tell you. Sure, I know people individually who want to be green because they care about the planet and they want to actually create systematic and real change. Sure, I know those people, but the broad green movement is not those people. The broad green movement is a power grab, and people who will worship this what is quote unquote green, literally on the bodies of dead people. And look, I think the Ukraine situation with Russia sucks every way. I'm not a pro Zelensky. If you listen to this show, you know that we don't love Ukraine either. But we don't love Putin either. Putin sucks. Putin's awful. Putin's evil. Russia's evil in many ways. And this conflict is just a horrible thing, regardless of if you think certain things are justified or not. It doesn't matter. To say that the green revolution is being sped up by this is a good thing. It's just as sick and disgusting as people talking about how World War II was great for employment in the United States. It's the exact same thing. And people don't realize how callous and disgusting a take that is. And they just repeat it because their high school history teacher told them that. But this is
World War II got us out of the Depression. Right?
Exactly. Right. Yep. Yeah. And this is the exact same thing, and it's just as evil and heinous here.
It's really something, man, because the biggest polluter, in the entire world is the United States military, right? When you look at it, that's basically all of our carbon emissions come from the manufacturing, movement, and distribution of these different types of weapons and things and personnel and all this stuff. And so it's I really wonder, let's calculate, sure, people in Europe are no longer going to be able to heat their homes because they don't have any more gas. People are going to die freezing to death in their homes. I wonder how much of that is saved versus, the cost of rolling tanks and aircraft and ordnance from the Russian army and the Ukrainian army and all the weapons that the United States and NATO is sending to Ukraine. I bet that it is net negative, in terms of emissions and all those things. Not to mention, just the incredible environmental impact that happens when you start chucking grenades and missiles everywhere onto, into the breadbasket of Europe, right? It's just completely anti-human for these folks to say what they're saying about this. The other aspect of it too is just like they really show the game, right? Like you touched on it, like they are just incredibly anti-human. Like it's like, oh great, we need to save the planet because we won't have a planet. Your children or your grandchildren or your great grandchildren, you're not going to be able to have a planet for them. So therefore, let's facilitate nuclear war so that they don't even exist. So there will be no grandchildren to inherit a toxic planet because there will be no humans whatsoever. And it just really shows you how far an ideology can go in poisoning the mind. I think about normal people really want. I myself, I want to think about how do I use my resources, use my life sustainably. I don't like chucking wrappers out my window. I don't chuck wrappers out my window. I try and clean things up the way best I can. But the reality is the only way that you actually get towards more sustainable things is with better technology. My buddy was analyzing the payback for installing solar panels on his house. $40,000 for him after subsidy to install solar panels on his house, and the payback was 18 years, which is unacceptable. That basically means the solar panels have a net negative impact financially. And I think it was only just recently that solar panels actually create more energy than they use to be built in their lifetime. So awesome, but like we need to be facilitating that. And this kind of plays into the broader myth, right? That like, oh, well, war advances technology. It's like, no, I don't think destruction of property, destruction of resources, destruction of people, destruction of, the opportunity cost of the world's smartest brains focused on building more things to kill more people advances technology at all. It might advance better ways of killing people, but it's very rough to say that it actually advances this technology that leads to this. So on all angles, on all fronts, the war in Ukraine, the war with Russia, Putin, none of it is good for the environment, and none of it ever will be.
Well, and I think another great option for us would be to think about maybe writing an article about how, dropping the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki really helped them improve their transit system. There
was zero demand, for years.
They were able to build anew and make really great technology without all that old pesky infrastructure and like humans in the way, So yeah, I completely agree. And I mean, again, I cite, the examples of the mismanagement of green resources all the time. But like, man, a great example just of the anti-human green movement too is how in Washington state, there's this big movement to try to get rid of the Snake River dams on the east side of our state, and that creates the vast majority of green energy in Washington state. So we're purporting to try to be environmentally friendly, but we want to remove it because of the salmon returns, which, by the way, the salmon returns have been increasing every year for the past like 3 or 4 years. So we're getting more salmon, and tearing down these dams would only help these salmon by like a fraction, like maybe a couple percent. It's very, very, very minor. And doing it would delete probably, I think it's about almost a quarter of the energy that Washington produces. And it's green energy. So, again, if this wasn't a purely ideological thing about wanting to help the planet, that would be one thing. But these people aren't even consistent with that. They don't even truly care about that. They just care about the power dynamics and making you reliant on whatever it is, or promoting the agenda and knocking people, or bringing people into this ideology to control their behaviors on a micro level, which is harder for them to do. So I don't know. I found this tweet absolutely disgusting and just horrifying.
Pretty funny in a lot of ways too.
It is funny, yeah. It's funny, but it's also just.
It's like maybe they're trying to think of like, oh, how do I look at this as the glass half full?
Yeah,
nuclear war, or green. It's like, oh yeah, I guess worst case scenario, there is humans are gone, the biggest contributors to climate change.
Yeah, oof. Okay, we'll go ahead and go to our last slide for the episode, and that is it's the one we alluded to a little bit earlier. Our good buddy Joe Walsh here. Okay, so Joe Walsh starts his tweet, the first tweet saying, Politically, I'm conservative and I'm woke, newly woke, proudly woke. Just means my eyes are now open to basic injustices and inequities. My eyes weren't always open, but now they are. I think that's a good thing. And yes, I'm still a conservative. And then someone replied saying, those are mutually exclusive. You literally cannot be both. If you are awake to the inequities and injustices and still favor the systems that produce them, you are willfully in favor of those inequities and injustices. And Joe Walsh replies, instead of calling myself conservative, here's what I believe. I believe in freedom, free markets, free trade, free speech, expanded legal immigration, and a very limited federal government. I'm also proudly woke, and I don't consider that at all mutually exclusive. The phrase limited government, and then someone replies saying, the phrase, quote, limited government, quote, is code as old as time for reduced programs benefiting people who aren't white men. Quote, free markets, unquote, is code for strip away protections that keep the wealthy and powerful and from further exploiting people with less. And then someone else replies, I see this the same. Limited government means less restrictions on things like environment protection and pollution. Free market was the motto of the 2008 housing crash.
Oh boy.
You let companies and banks run without regulations, they will take full advantage of it, and we suffer. Dude, there is so much cringe to get through with this. I mean, like, wow, we're already at the length of some of our episodes. We're gonna get a little bit. This one might be a long one, boys. Goodness. Okay, let's start with Joe Walsh saying, I'm conservative and woke, and I'm proud about that and all that kind of thing. Like, okay, the thing is, seeing inequalities and inequities in systems is not a bad thing. Okay, so for instance, I think that it is a good thing to recognize that some of the systems that exist per the government regulation, generally speaking, have provided unequal outcomes in ways that are not fair. So sometimes unequal outcomes happen because life isn't fair. So sometimes someone lives on plot A of land and someone lives on plot B of land, and a hurricane comes through and destroys plot A but not plot B. That's unequal and it's not deserved, right? But that doesn't mean that the hurricane was done, it wasn't a racist outcome, right? That there's you don't have to buy into that. So recognizing that there is a level of unequalness that are created by some systems is different. So you can recognize that again by government. You can say the cocaine versus the crack cocaine versus white powder cocaine legal rules where they cracked harder down on crack cocaine because that was a little bit more poor and it was a little bit more circulated in black communities. You could view that as something that's unequal because of racism. You could view it unequal because of classism. Whatever it is, I would recognizing that there is a systemic, you might say, problem there. Okay, that is fine. The problem with wokeism is that it seeks to ascribe every single unequal outcome to the systemic or perniciously prescribed level of inequality. So for instance, in my hurricane example, if you were woke, you wouldn't think, wow, that really sucks. You'd think, because a black person lived on plot A, white people need to pay for that. Or that it was a systemic example of black communities being, once again, more at risk of hurricane exposure. And it's like, look, not everything needs to be reduced into these labels of race and gender and identity that people want to split us up by. Sometimes there are outcomes that lead to these scenarios, but like the human history of people and different races living on different parts of the planet start with levels of inequality. That's a feature of life, whether we like it or not. And there's any number of factors that play into where people are, what things happen, what all these different factors. So to view the lens, to say that I now see that there are injustices, well, you're that's again good, but you should also recognize that not everything is the direct result of racism, of identity politics, and that's the biggest problem with wokeism, right? And so I feel like Joe Walsh is trying to play the label game and have his cake and eat it too a little bit, especially in the next tweet when he's talking about, I believe in freedom, free markets, free trade, free speech. He lists all these things out. Great. It's great to say that you're for all those things, but then when you're talking about how January 6th is a threat to democracy and these people need to be prosecuted, you actually don't believe in freedom. You don't really believe in very limited federal government if you're supporting the institution using the Patriot Act to crack down on people who walked into an open door building on, again, allegedly public property. So to wrap up this thought before I pass to you, just to say, he says I'm woke. Okay, but then you define it a little bit differently than how they would. And I actually tend to think you're probably a little bit more into the what is popularly accepted as woke, just because you don't want to get eaten by the left because you're tired of, being criticized. I think that's why you want to call yourself woke. But then you define it a little bit that's not quite accurate. And then second, you call yourself conservative, but then when it comes to actually promoting any individual thing that is conservative, you just use all the labels, but you don't actually promote any of the ideology that goes along with it. So yeah, it's kind of like all the Republicans saying, "Oh, I've got libertarian blood in my veins," like Jeb Bush said once. It's like, okay, well then prove it, do something with it, and they never do.
I'll have to go look that up. That's hilarious. Please clap.
It's great. He's my president.
Yeah, Jeb. Joe Walsh. Like, I think he did a great job laying out like the woke side of it for him. I think on the conservative side, I'd ask him. It's like, okay, you claim to be conservative, but what have you conserved? What traditional value have you conserved? I don't even need you to go back 20 years. That's not that long ago for a value that you conserve. Let's even just go back like 4 or 5. It's like, oh, Joe Walsh has not, conserved anything. Whether it's freedom of, what you put in your body, free markets, which is like, hey, like, I don't think we should force people to be open or not open, during the COVID pandemic. Same thing with free trade, free speech. Joe Walsh was very critical of Joe Rogan in terms of, and is a big proponent of these different tech platforms being pressured by the government to censor free speech. And then this, this very limited government aspect that we haven't touched on yet. The phrase limited government is code as old as time for reduced programs benefiting white people who aren't white men. It's like, okay, that's just absurd on its face. There are countries that are full of predominantly not white folks that have limited government. There's this gal named Maguette. She was on not Joe Rogan, on Jordan Peterson's podcast, and she immigrated from Senegal. And she talks about how, like, if you look at a map of the most pro-business, pro-economic freedom countries in Africa, and overlay it with a map of the countries that are also doing the best in terms of like poverty rate and people, all that stuff. They're basically correlated, right? The more economic freedom you have, the less government, the more limited the government is and how it interacts with your day-to-day life, the better people are. And as far as I'm concerned, and as far as anyone else is concerned, the folks in those countries are predominantly not white. The last tweet, I see this same limited government means less restrictions on things like environmental protection and pollution. It was the motto for the 2008 housing crash. It's like, oh my gosh, man. Like the whole reason the 2008, the environment for the 2008 crash began was because all of the bankers were literally saying, we can do these credit default swaps. We can sell these bundles of mortgages to each other and print money, basically, because even if it all falls through, we know that Big Daddy government is going to come through and save us. That is not limited government. That is not free market. That is as big a government as you can ever get, because they're literally saying we're going to take from the little guy and we're going to give to the big guy. And kind of going back to the Alex Jones thing, the most that they were able to show which bank executives were the people that actually contributed and created the environment for the 2008 crisis. To me, they're just operating within their own self-interest, right? The government said, hey, here's this mechanism and this lever. If you pull it, you'll make a bunch of money. It's like, as a business owner, why would you not pull it? That aside, this person is still a scumbag, and he only paid $64 million in fines compared to Alex Jones' $1 billion. So that's not limited government. The other side of it too, whenever people bring up, oh, well, who's going to protect the environment? From things like the Flint, Michigan water crisis. It's like, oh, you mean like the EPA or the Flint government that literally decided to move the water from Lake Huron to the Flint, Michigan River That's what caused the entire lead poisoning in the first place. And the EPA, because they are trying to do some people certain favors, failed to report it for 10 months. It's like, you mean like environmental disasters like that? Like we need to have the EPA to prevent an environmental disaster that the EPA basically ignored and didn't address. And if they'd addressed it earlier, would have fixed it. So it's like, all of these things that people talk about, as our the guest that we had, Larry Sharp, said, the dystopian future is already now. All these things that you talk about, if we didn't have government, we'd have polluted rivers and we'd have collapsed buildings that weren't permitted. We'd have, bankers being bailed out and not doing things that they're supposed to. It's like, oh, well, that's here now. And we have the government. So I don't know what you're trying to say here. Like maybe we should try I don't like limited government. I like no government. Other than the government that I voluntarily say I'm going to be subject to whatever you say, which would probably be basically none of them. So, these people don't know what they're talking about, or they haven't really thought through, the scenarios or the things that we've talked about. Because it's like, well, those are here today. The scenarios that you bring up are ones that have already happened, and they've happened under the biggest government that has ever existed in the history of mankind.
That's exactly right. And I I always crack up thinking about the phraseology that the people below are using, where it's like, this is code for this or that. And it's like, you really have to be careful when you say things are going to be code for this or that, because if you can't draw the link, then you are literally just projecting what you want something to say, or what, I could take this person's tweet themselves and say, oh, saying something is a code for I'm a brain dead dummy who doesn't know anything. Oh, look, I did no actual work of drawing it. Now, so for instance, when you and I would claim something to say, like, for instance, there should be a law, I wouldn't even say is code for, because that implies that there's this nebulous level of connection. I would much rather say, when you say there should be a law, you are implying. And then, because then you actually have to draw out the connection, right? You have to make the link. So, again, the most similar example I can think is when you say there should be a law, you are actually saying that this should be forced at gunpoint. And if I were to say that, you might laugh at me. But when you go through each of the steps, I can make the argument and link it, right? To say, okay, so you're telling me that if I do not pay my Social Security from if you don't withhold that and I don't give it to the government, what happens? Well, then they'll try to find me even more. Okay. Well, if I don't pay that, well, then they will probably send someone to collect. And if I don't pay, then they will probably try to take me to jail. And if I resist, they will try to forcibly take me there. They will use force to subdue me to do their bidding. That's how you make that connection. But these people can't do that, because when they say, oh, free markets is code for, or limited government is code for, and they laws that benefit people or who are only white men, or whatever your stupid argument is, they can't actually make that claim because there's no links there. There's none. Free markets and free trade and limited government, those things essentially are to say, remove barriers into human cooperation. That is what those things mean, and at a base level. And if you think that means, if you're implying that you need to have laws that restrict human behavior in order to help, or I don't know, I guess how they're phrasing this, but if you're implying that removing laws that interfere with human behavior only benefits white men, and that white men only benefit when there is mutual cooperation, that's a pretty racist thing to think. Because my take is that it doesn't really matter what your race is, that if you're a human and you want to cooperate with mutual voluntary behavior and exchange, then society's going to flourish. And I don't care what your skin color is. This person seems to think that if you remove the barriers to cooperation and people are just going to cooperate, somehow only white people are going to benefit. And that's kind of a racist thought to me. Obviously, I don't think they mean that, because the full bearing of their of that thought probably isn't what they're going for. But it's still it's a crazy thing to say and to think. So I don't know. I hate this is code for, because you really have no way of proving your claim there.
Yeah, it just appeals to someone's preconceptions one way or the other,
right?
Which is really not fair.
Yeah, exactly right. Okay, well, all that being said, I think that's the episode. So thank you guys so much for tuning in, and we will catch you on the next one. Take care.